Well, you've gone that route once before with Comes the Horseman.
Yeah, I got nominated in '77.
So, Richard Farnsworth was one of Hollywood's most respected stuntmen and actors, known for his quiet personality, remarkable courage, and unforgettable performances. For decades, stories about his life, dangerous stunts, and experiences behind the scenes sounded almost too unbelievable to be true. Yet those who worked with him insisted there was much more to Farnsworth than audiences ever saw. From extraordinary moments on set to stories that challenged everything people thought they knew about him. But which stories were actually true, and what happened when people finally saw the evidence? This is the story. Number 1, the boy who lost everything but the horses. So this is where the story of Richard Farnsworth really begins. Born on September 1, 1920 in Los Angeles, California, Richard's childhood looked ordinary at first. His father worked as an engineer, his mother cared for the family, and he grew up alongside his 2 sisters. But when Richard was only 7 years old, his father died, leaving the young boy growing up in a household where his mother, aunt, and sisters had to face the hardships of the Great Depression without the security his father had provided. Richard struggled in school and seemed unlikely to follow a conventional path. But then, he discovered something that changed his life completely: horses. By the age of 10, Richard had learned to ride, and something immediately clicked. On horseback, the boy who struggled inside a classroom suddenly seemed completely at home. He understood balance, movement, timing, and courage in a way that could not be taught from a textbook. By 15, Richard had dropped out of high school and started working at a Los Angeles polo barn. He cleaned stalls, exercised horses, and earned only about $5 a week. Then, in 1937, everything changed. Paramount Pictures placed an advertisement looking for hundreds of riders for the adventures of Marco Polo. Richard answered the call. He spent weeks writing for the production, earning far more than he had at the polo barn. And when his first movie paycheck arrived, the teenage stable boy had earned enough to buy his first car. Richard thought he had simply found a better-paying job. He had no idea he had just opened the door to a Hollywood career that would eventually last more than 6 decades. But the biggest surprise was still ahead. Richard struggled to cope in the classroom, yet he mastered the art of horse riding at a very young age. But how far would his horse riding skills take him? And could he really prove his expertise under pressure? Let's uncover the astonishing details. Number 2, 500 horsemen and a career born in the dust. Now, this is where Richard's unlikely Hollywood journey truly began. His first major screen experience came with The Adventures of Marco Polo, starring Gary Cooper. Richard was one of hundreds of riders dressed as Mongolian horsemen, racing across the Paramount backlot. Nobody knew his name. Nobody was looking for him. He was simply another rider in a massive crowd. But there was something different about Farnsworth. He could ride exceptionally well. He could handle difficult horses, perform dangerous falls, fight from horseback, and move between horses at speed. Those abilities quickly attracted the attention of people behind the scenes. Before long, the anonymous rider was becoming one of Hollywood's most dependable horsemen. He worked on productions including A Day at the Races, Gunga Din, and Gone with the Wind. In those early years, however, his face rarely mattered. Directors needed someone who could perform the dangerous work while the stars remained safely positioned for the camera. Richard was exactly that man. He could gallop into dangerous situations, perform difficult riding sequences, take falls, and make the action look effortless. The money was better than the polo barn, but recognition remained almost non-existent. For decades, that would become Richard's strange reality. He was everywhere. He worked alongside famous actors. He appeared in some of the biggest movies Hollywood had ever produced, yet audiences had no idea who he was. But eventually, one of Hollywood's biggest cowboy stars would place an extraordinary amount of trust in him, and that relationship would change Farnsworth's career forever. So, Richard's expertise in horse riding earned him a place in the Hollywood industry. But to what extent did he earn the trust of those around him? And was he known to viewers as an expert or did others receive the glory for his work? Let's find out. Number 3. The only man Roy Rogers trusted with his horse. By the mid-1940s, Richard Farnsworth had earned a reputation as one of Republic Studios' most dependable stuntmen. Then came an opportunity that showed just how trusted he had become, working closely with legendary cowboy star Roy Rogers. For years, Farnsworth became Roy Rogers' trusted stunt double and stand-in. Whenever dangerous riding, tough fights, dramatic falls, or difficult horsework was required, Richard stepped in and handled the risky moments with remarkable confidence. That level of trust was extraordinary. Hollywood stars could not afford mistakes during dangerous action scenes. One wrong movement could result in a serious injury. So when a performer repeatedly proved he could handle the job, studios remembered him. Richard became that reliable professional. He doubled for stars including Kirk Douglas, Henry Fonda, Montgomery Clift, Gary Cooper, Steve McQueen, and Guy Madison. He worked on productions such as Wild Bill Hickok, The Lone Ranger, The Ten Commandments, and The Tin Star. He performed riding sequences alongside some of the biggest names in Hollywood, but there was an irony at the center of it all. The better Richard became, the less the audience knew about him. Richard was performing dangerous work that demanded courage, strength, and perfect timing. Yet audiences usually applauded the famous actors on screen, while the skilled man behind their most daring moments remained almost completely unknown. Richard was the man behind the hero. And after hundreds of productions, 3 decades of dangerous work, and countless moments when he put his body on the line, he was still largely invisible. Despite Richard's effort and skill in projects that involved horse riding, he remained largely unrecognized. But what would he do to make himself visible? And would his decision finally help him earn the recognition he deserved? Now, let's uncover the story of the stuntman who finally decided to fight for himself. Number 4. 11 months as a gladiator. In 1960, legendary director Stanley Kubrick began filming Spartacus, an enormous Hollywood production that demanded thousands of performers and some of the era's most difficult scenes. Richard Farnsworth spent months on the film as a stunt performer, riding horses, handling demanding action scenes, and taking part in massive battles that tested his remarkable skills. The work was physically demanding, but Richard was no stranger to hardship. Decades of stunts, dangerous rides, and difficult scenes had prepared him for moments like these. What became more important was what the experience made him realize. The stunt performers who made Hollywood's spectacular action possible had very little organized protection. They performed dangerous work, often without the recognition given to the actors whose doubles they were. Richard had spent years watching people risk their safety while remaining almost completely invisible, so he decided to do something about it. In 1961, Farnsworth helped co-found the Stuntmen's Association of Motion Pictures, an organization focused on improving the rights, safety, and working conditions of stunt performers. For perhaps the first time, Richard was not simply helping somebody else's career. He was using his own reputation to fight for the people behind the scenes, and that decision revealed something important about him. Richard Farnsworth was not simply a cowboy who happened to work in Hollywood. He was a man with strong principles, a deep sense of responsibility, and a willingness to stand up for people who rarely received recognition. Still, his own career remained stuck behind the camera. He continued working with major directors and appearing in major productions. But by the 1970s, his body was beginning to show the cost of decades of physical work. And Richard was approaching an age when most Hollywood performers were thinking about retirement. So, in an effort to make himself more visible, Richard Farnsworth helped co-found the Stuntmen's Association of Motion Pictures. But did this finally give him the recognition he wanted, or did he realize that he needed to explore another path? And if so, what other option did he pursue? Let's find out. Number 5. The reinvention at 55. Here's something important to understand about Richard Farnsworth. He wasn't pretending to be a cowboy. He really was one. Richard competed professionally in rodeo during his younger years, worked with horses throughout his life, and eventually lived on ranches with his family. His lifestyle was deeply connected to the values he carried into Hollywood. That included a remarkable personal rule. Richard became known for refusing to use profanity in his movie roles. Even after appearing in dozens of productions with speaking parts, he maintained that standard throughout his career. It was a small detail, but it revealed something much bigger about him. Richard simply refused to become somebody else just because Hollywood expected it. By the mid-1970s, however, his body was becoming increasingly worn down by years of stunt work. Falls, fights, horse accidents, and physically demanding productions had taken their toll. So around the age of 55, Farnsworth stepped away from stunt work and began focusing almost entirely on acting. It was an extraordinary gamble. He had spent nearly 4 decades being the man behind the star. Now, he was asking Hollywood to look directly at him. His first significant speaking roles came later in the 1970s, including a part in The Duchess and The Dirtwater Fox. It was not a massive breakthrough, but it proved something important. Richard Farnsworth could stand in front of the camera without needing to perform a stunt. He could speak. He could listen. He could make a character feel real. And then, in 1978, one director gave him a role that would finally force Hollywood to reconsider everything it thought it knew about him. Here's what happened. At an age when Richard should have been considering retirement, he was given an acting role after spending decades as a horseman and stuntman in Hollywood. But could he succeed in this completely new role? And if he did, to what extent would his performance be recognized and applauded? Let's uncover the remarkable details. Number 6. The Oscar nomination nobody saw coming now. This is where Richard Farnsworth's story takes a remarkable turn. In 1978, director Alan J. Pakula gave Richard Farnsworth a major opportunity, casting him alongside Jane Fonda and James Caan in Comes a Horseman, changing his career forever. Richard played Dodger, an aging ranch hand whose quiet strength, gentle nature, and believable presence made the character feel real, memorable, and surprisingly powerful to audiences. For once, he didn't need to fall from a horse. He didn't need to perform a dangerous stunt. He didn't need to double for another actor. He simply had to act. And what came out of that performance surprised almost everyone. Farnsworth's acting felt natural because he wasn't trying to manufacture the life of a cowboy. He had lived that life. Critics began recognizing something Hollywood had overlooked for decades. Richard Farnsworth could act. Then, in 1979, at 58, Richard Farnsworth achieved the unthinkable, an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor after decades in Hollywood. Think about how extraordinary that was. He had entered Hollywood as a teenage writer. For decades, he had been the man standing behind the stars. Suddenly, the Hollywood industry that had overlooked Richard for decades was putting his name beside respected stars, finally recognizing the talent it had ignored for so long. He did not win the Oscar, but the nomination changed the way people viewed him, and it proved that his acting career was not simply a late-life hobby. Richard Farnsworth had genuinely found another calling. But if Hollywood thought his best performance had already arrived, it was about to be proven completely wrong. So, Richard was not only applauded for his early acting roles, but he was also recognized with an Oscar nomination later in his life and career. But could he deliver the same level of excellence if given a leading role instead of a supporting one? And what would become of the movie in which he finally took the lead? Let's uncover the captivating details. Number 7. The Gentleman Bandit Who Changed Everything. In 1982, young director Philip Borsos gave Richard Farnsworth an unexpected opportunity that would transform his career, finally pushing the veteran stuntman into the spotlight as a leading actor. The film was The Gray Fox, inspired by the true story of Bill Miner, an aging stagecoach robber who walked free after decades behind bars. Thrust back into a rapidly changing world, Miner soon found himself drawn toward one final adventure. Farnsworth was not originally the first choice for the role, but circumstances changed, and suddenly, the part belonged to him. And what he did with it became one of the greatest late-career transformations in Hollywood history. Farnsworth played Miner with extraordinary calmness and humanity. Instead of turning the character into a simple outlaw, He made him feel like a complicated man trying to understand a world that had changed while he was away. The performance connected with audiences and critics. The Grey Fox became a major success in Canada, winning numerous awards, including Best Actor for Farnsworth. He also received international recognition and a Golden Globe nomination. Most importantly, at the age of 62, Richard Farnsworth finally became a leading man. After more than 4 decades in Hollywood, someone had finally trusted him to carry an entire movie, and he proved that age had not diminished his talent. In fact, it seemed to have deepened it. The man who had spent decades pretending to be someone else's cowboy was finally allowed to tell his own story. But the Grey Fox did something else. It opened doors that had remained closed to Richard for most of his life. And during the 1980s and 1990s, audiences were about to discover just how much this quiet cowboy could do. Astonishingly, Richard took a leading role in Hollywood at the age of 62, yet his performance stunned both audiences and critics. But what rewards came with his outstanding performance? And could those honors truly make up for the years he spent waiting for his breakthrough? Let's uncover the fascinating details. Number 8. The sudden attention from Hollywood. Now, this is where Richard Farnsworth's transformation becomes impossible to ignore. For most of his career, Farnsworth had been the man standing behind the stars. He was the writer, the stuntman, the dependable performer who helped other actors look convincing while his own name remained largely unknown. But once Richard moved into character acting, something remarkable began to happen. Hollywood started looking at him differently. His performance in Comes a Horseman became a major turning point. Instead of being judged for how well he could ride or perform dangerous stunts, Farnsworth was being judged for something completely different: his ability to make a character feel real. Critics noticed. He received recognition from the National Board of Review and the National Society of Film Critics, followed by an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor. And then came The Grey Fox. As Bill Miner, Farnsworth finally became the leading man Hollywood had somehow overlooked for decades. The performance earned him a Genie Award for Best Actor and a Golden Globe nomination, proving that his late arrival in leading roles was not a fluke. Then, Anne of Green Gables brought even more recognition, including a Gemini Award. Suddenly, the quiet stuntman who had spent decades disappearing behind famous actors was becoming the performer critics wanted to talk about. But here's what makes Farnsworth's success so fascinating. He never had to reinvent himself completely. The qualities that made him an exceptional horseman were the same qualities that made his acting so believable. His years around horses, ranches, rodeos, and Western life gave him something acting classes could never manufacture. He understood the people he was portraying because he had lived close to their world. Richard Farnsworth didn't have to pretend to be authentic. He simply had to be himself. And after decades of Hollywood looking past him, people were finally starting to see what had been there all along. So, Richard was not only applauded for his extraordinary roles after many years of being overlooked, but he was also rewarded for his performances. But would he be content with those late career successes? Or would his determination and genuine love for acting push him toward new projects? Let's unravel the emotional details. Number 9. 240 miles on a lawn. Mower Now. This is where the story becomes deeply emotional. In 1994, an elderly Iowa man named Alvin Strait made an extraordinary journey to visit his brother after learning that his health was failing. Strait could not drive a car, so he traveled hundreds of miles on a small riding lawnmower. The journey eventually caught the attention of filmmaker David Lynch. Lynch saw something beyond the strange details of the trip. He saw a story about family, regret, determination, aging, and the desire to make peace before time ran out. For the film adaptation, The Strait Story, Lynch needed someone who did not look like he was acting. He needed someone who could simply sit on a mower, look across the American landscape, and make the audience believe they were watching a real man carrying decades of memories with him. He chose Richard Farnsworth. Farnsworth came out of retirement for the role, but there was something the production had to work around. By this point, Richard was seriously ill with metastatic prostate cancer. His condition affected his mobility, and filming became physically difficult. Yet the illness never overwhelmed his performance. Instead, it seemed to bring an extraordinary honesty to his portrayal of Alvin Strait. His quiet delivery, tired expressions, and restrained emotions made the character feel painfully real. In 2000, Farnsworth received an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor at the age of 97, making him the oldest nominee in that category at the time. He lost the Oscar, but his achievement was already extraordinary. After 63 years in Hollywood, Richard Farnsworth had reached the highest point of his acting career. But behind the applause was a reality very few people could fully see. His health was deteriorating rapidly, and the man who had spent his entire life playing tough, determined characters was now facing the hardest chapter of his own life. Here's what happened. Richard came out of retirement to take on a leading role in a movie that eventually revealed how seriously ill he had become. But how long could he continue battling the illness? And what remarkable lesson can be learnt from his extraordinary career? Now, let's explore the legacy Richard Farnsworth left behind. Number 10. The Cowboy's Final Chapter. By the final months of Richard Farnsworth's life, the cancer that had been threatening him had become far more serious. His illness had spread, and his physical condition was becoming increasingly difficult. For a man who had spent most of his life riding horses, performing demanding stunts, and pushing through physical challenges, losing that independence must have been especially difficult. Richard died in October 2000, only weeks after turning 80. His death brought an end to one of Hollywood's most unusual careers, but it also left behind a story that is almost impossible to forget. Richard had entered Hollywood as a teenage stable boy after answering a newspaper advertisement for horse riders. From there, he spent decades working behind some of the biggest names in cinema. He doubled for stars such as Roy Rogers, Gary Cooper, Henry Fonda, Kirk Douglas, and Steve McQueen. He performed dangerous riding sequences, worked on major productions, and helped fight for better treatment and safer conditions for stunt performers. Yet, despite all those years, audiences still barely knew his name. Then, Richard made a remarkable decision. After nearly 4 decades as a stuntman, he began building a second career as an actor. And suddenly, the man who had spent years hiding behind other stars was being recognized in his own right. At 58, he received his first Academy Award nomination. At 62, he became a leading man in The Gray Fox. Then, at 79, he earned another Oscar nomination for The Straight Story, giving one of the most deeply human performances of his career. And that may be the greatest lesson in Farnsworth's story. Hollywood took decades to notice him, but Richard never needed fame to define his worth. He was a cowboy before he was an actor. He was a stuntman before he became a star. And when the cameras finally turned toward him, those forgotten years suddenly looked very different. The horses had prepared him. The stunts had prepared him. The years of being overlooked had prepared him. Richard Farnsworth did not arrive too late. He arrived when the world was finally ready to see what had been there all along. So, what do you think about Richard Farnsworth's story? Did his stuntman years prepare him for Hollywood success? We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe.